When I turned a corner, I never knew what I'd find. Sometimes a Japanese soldier, sometimes a Filipino civilian, sometimes both. And every single time, the same decision: fire or die. From the post-war testimony of an American soldier who served in the Battle of Manila, February 1945. By the time the fighting was over, the city was unrecognizable. February 1945. Manila, the Philippines. It was a large city, home to 600,000 people. Wide boulevards, stone bridges, old Spanish walls, modern hotels. One of the most cosmopolitan cities in the Pacific. People spoke English, went to the cinema, read the newspaper, and now it was burning. Japanese forces had dug into the city. The orders were clear: defend Manila. But this was not a conventional defense. The Japanese had turned every building, every bridge, every church into a fortress. Walls had been breached for firing positions. Tunnels had been dug, machine guns had been set into windowsills, and caught in the middle of all of it were 100,000 civilians. Sergeant Robert Hendricks served with the 1st Cavalry Division. He was from Texas, 23 years old. Before coming to Southeast Asia, he had never imagined Manila, had barely thought about the Philippines. He had seen combat in the Pacific, but this was different. Island fighting meant jungle, sand, open ground. Here there were buildings, streets, and at the end of every street, something waiting to kill you. On February 3rd, American forces entered the city. Hendricks described that first day like this: "When we came in, people threw flowers at us. They welcomed us like liberators. 2 days later, their homes were on fire."
The Battle of Manila ran from February 3rd to March 3rd, 1940. American forces were under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. The Japanese defense was directed by Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, with approximately 17,000 Japanese troops dug into the city. Manila was at that time one of the most developed cities in Southeast Asia, known before the war as the Pearl of the Orient. Urban combat on this scale was unlike anything the Pacific War had produced before. The American military had not prepared adequately for city fighting of this kind.
The first days were deceptive. The northern parts of the city had fallen relatively quickly. Japanese resistance there was thin. Civilians had poured into the streets, some crying, some waving. Hendricks and his unit pushed south, and everything changed. South of the Pasig River, the city was completely different. Old Manila, Intramuros. 400 years of Spanish walls, stone 5 meters thick, and inside, civilians and Japanese. When Hendricks turned the first corner, fire came down from above, second floor of a building across the street. One of his men went down. Hendricks pressed himself against the wall. He scanned the window. But beside the window, he saw something else. A child, standing in the middle of the street, frozen, terrified, unable to move. Hendricks didn't know what to do. The fire was still coming. His man was on the ground, maybe dead, maybe wounded. The child was standing in the open. He shouted. He didn't know Tagalog. He shouted in English. The child didn't understand or couldn't respond. Then the soldier beside him broke from the wall, grabbed the child, pulled back to cover. A round passed directly behind him. Both of them were alive. That night, Hendricks wrote in his notes, "This war is different. The enemy is everywhere. Civilians are everywhere. You can't tell them apart. That's the thing that frightens me most."
One of the greatest tactical difficulties in urban combat is distinguishing friend from enemy. In Manila, that problem reached an extreme. Japanese forces used civilian buildings, churches, and hospitals as fighting positions. As American units advanced, every structure became a potential threat. Decisions about when to call in artillery or air support became extraordinarily complicated. Evidence gathered after the battle documented that a large proportion of civilian deaths resulted from Japanese violence against civilians sheltering in buildings. But American artillery fire also caused civilian casualties.
Day 5. Hendricks and his unit were standing outside the walls of Intramuros. Inside, thousands of civilians and 4,000 Japanese soldiers. The order came down from command. Artillery support would be called in. When Hendricks heard it, his stomach tightened. Artillery meant destruction. Artillery meant the civilians inside those walls. But without it, there was no way through. Every attempt to breach had been costly. Men were going down one by one. The commander was clear. There is no other option. Hendricks didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the child in the middle of the street. And now there were more of them inside those walls. Morning came. The artillery opened up. The walls shook. Smoke rose. Every sound ran into the next. Explosions, screaming, stone collapsing. Hendricks leaned against the wall and waited. Jaw set, eyes closed. When the fire stopped, he stood up, gripped his rifle, moved forward through the gap. The first thing he saw was rubble. The second was a wounded Filipino woman. The third was a Japanese position, still active. Hendricks went flat. The fighting continued.
To break through Intramuros, American forces were forced to deploy 105 mm and 155 mm artillery. Weapons of that caliber caused extensive damage to the historic walls and everything inside them. From a military standpoint, artillery was the most effective way to reduce casualties among attacking troops. But it simultaneously increased civilian casualties. The legal framework under international law at the time was contested. In the decades since, these decisions have been assessed in very different ways by historians. What is not in dispute is that the Intramuros battle exacted an extremely heavy price, both militarily and in human terms.
The second week, Manila was no longer recognizable. The city Hendricks had entered was gone. Wide boulevards had become mountains of rubble. Hotels had burned. Bridges had come down. And at every corner, behind every pile of wreckage, something else was waiting. Hendricks was moving with a small group, 4 men. Their assignment was to clear a city block. They entered the ground floor, empty. They went up to the second, a door on the right, a door on the left. Hendricks signaled right. Adams went left. The room on the right was empty. An explosion came from the left. Hendricks ran. Adams was on the floor. A grenade. His left arm was bleeding badly, but he was alive. In the back corner of the room, a Japanese soldier, young, very young, maybe 2 or 3 years younger than Hendricks. He had a weapon but hadn't raised it. The two of them looked at each other. 1 second, 2 seconds. Hendricks pulled the trigger. Then he dropped down beside Adams, pulled out the bandage. His hands were shaking. Adams cried out in pain. Hendricks pressed down hard. "Stay quiet," he said. "Stay quiet." Sounds from below, getting closer. Hendricks pulled Adams onto his shoulder, moved toward the stairs. Every step, Adams groaned. Every step, the sounds got closer. When they came out of the building, the sun was going down. Clouds of smoke hung over Manila. A red sunset, almost beautiful. That beauty was the thing that disturbed Hendricks most that day.
The building-by-building advance through Manila caused heavy casualties for American forces. Every structure was its own battlefield. The Japanese had tunneled between buildings, breaching walls to connect positions. A unit that cleared one building would frequently come under fire from the next one over. This slowed the advance considerably and drove up the cost in lives. The American military had no experience of urban combat at this scale before Manila. The battle became a reference point in the development of urban warfare doctrine in the decades that followed.
The third week, Adams had been taken to the aid station. His arm had been saved, but he would never hold a weapon again. When Hendricks heard that, he stayed quiet for a long time. The division's casualties kept climbing. Every day, new names were missing. Hendricks had stopped memorizing them. There was no point. The ones you memorized today, you might lose tomorrow. But some faces wouldn't leave. The face of that young Japanese soldier wouldn't leave. Hendricks never told anyone. There was no language for it. In war, you kill the man across from you. That was the rule. It was necessary. There was no other choice. But the face wouldn't leave. And the civilians. Every day he saw more of them, moving through the rubble, trying to get out of the city with nothing in their hands. Old people, children, mothers. The war hadn't chosen them. But the war had found them anyway. One day an old man approached Hendricks. He was holding a piece of paper. He held it out. Hendricks looked. An address was written on it, and underneath a few words in English. My family, are they alive? Hendricks didn't know that address. He had never reached that part of the city. He shook his head. The man waited. Hendricks shook his head again. The man walked away. Hendricks put the paper in his pocket. When the fighting was over, he tried to find that address. There was no building there anymore, only rubble.
American casualties in the Battle of Manila were recorded at approximately 1,000 killed and 5,000 wounded. Japanese losses were around 17,000, but the heaviest price was paid by civilians, as the documentation makes clear. Estimates range between 100,000 and 120,000 dead. Given how short the battle was, that number is extraordinarily high. The majority of civilian deaths were attributed to Japanese violence against civilians sheltering in buildings. Post-war tribunals recorded these acts as war crimes. The precise total of civilian casualties remains a subject of ongoing historical debate.
March 3rd, 1945. Manila fell. 28 days. Hendricks was on his feet, physically on his feet. A cut on his face, a bruise on his shoulder. Those would heal, other things wouldn't. Smoke was still rising over the city, rubble everywhere. Very little remained of what had been called the Pearl of the Orient. Some called it the Warsaw of the Pacific War afterward. It wasn't a bad comparison. Hendricks walked through the wreckage, looking for something familiar maybe, a reference point, something he could point to and say, this was a city once. He found a wall still standing, a faded poster on it, something written in Tagalog. He couldn't read it, but there was an image, a family, father, mother, children, an advertisement for something, it looked like, from before the war. Hendricks stopped, looked at it, then kept walking. In the years after the war, he never wanted to talk about Manila. When people asked, he said it was a hard fight. No details. Until the 1970s, in one interview, when he said this, I don't know what Warsaw felt like, but when I think about Manila, one word comes to mind. Unnecessary. 100,000 people died. In 1 month. In one city.
The Battle of Manila stands as one of the most destructive urban battles of the Second World War, mentioned alongside Stalingrad and Warsaw. Rebuilding the city took years. Some of the historic structures were never restored. Post-war investigations resulted in war crimes, proceedings against a number of Japanese commanders. Admiral Iwabuchi died during the battle. General Yamashita was executed in 1946. The Battle of Manila remains one of the most traumatic events in Philippine history and continues to be commemorated annually.
Hendricks died in 1998, in Texas, at home. He spoke very little about Manila for the rest of his life. When family asked at gatherings, he gave short answers. It was a hard fight, he said. We lost a lot of men, he said. That was all. But there was one thing he kept his whole life, the old man's piece of paper. He carried it in his pocket for years, then moved it to his wallet. The address had faded, the ink had run, but the paper was still there. His daughter found it after he died. She asked, "What is this?" Hendricks' wife didn't know. Nobody knew. Only Hendricks had known. And he was gone. Manila is back on its feet today. 14 million people live there. Wide boulevards, modern buildings, crowded markets. Very little remains of the city that existed before the war. Some of the walls are still standing. Some church facades are still there. But 100,000 people, in 1 month, in one city. That number is hard to hold in your mind. Try filling a stadium, then fill another one, then another. All of them in 1 month. Hendricks never said that number out loud, but he carried an old man's faded piece of paper in his wallet. Maybe that was his quiet way of saying it. Some things don't fit inside a number. Some things live on in a faded piece of paper in a wallet. And some questions never find an answer. My family, are they alive?
The legacy of the Battle of Manila continues to be debated on both historical and political grounds. The battle is commemorated every year in the Philippines. The number of surviving witnesses grows smaller each year. Historians continue to examine how the civilian casualties occurred, how responsibility should be apportioned, and where the line of war crimes was crossed. Manila is not only a battle, it is an ongoing question about the civilian cost of war. The silence of men like Hendricks tells you something about how heavy those questions are. History sometimes speaks loudest in silence.